Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 45. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com, and you can always access our information at thefederalnewswire.com as well. My guest today is David Moschella, non-resident senior fellow at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, in charge of its Defending Digital project. For more than a decade, David was head of worldwide research for IDC, the largest market analysis firm in the information technology industry, responsible for the company's global technology industry forecasts and analysis. His previous books include Seeing Digital, a visual guide to the industry's organizations and careers of the 2020s, Customer-Driven IT, Business School Press, and Waves of Power from Amacom. He has lectured and consulted on technology trends and strategies in more than 30 countries. David's current book, Tech Fears and Scapegoats, co-authored with Robert Atkinson, debunks 40 widespread myths about big tech, big data, AI, privacy, trust, polarization, automation, and similar fears, while exposing the scapegoating behind those complaints. While not the core focus of the book drives an interesting conversation about China that we look forward to engaging today. David, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Nice to be here.
Well, as I mentioned or forewarned in the pre-show, we love it when our guests share a little bit about their personal background and upbringing that helps our audience get to know who they're listening to and watching. My favorite question, if you happen to watch other episodes, you already know the trick coming. It's like when you were in sort of that third grade or elementary school and someone said, what did you want to do when you grow up? Did you say, I want to be a well-published author on the information technology industry?
Well, I probably wanted to be a baseball player, but I'm not sure that was a viable option. But yeah, for a long time, even in high school and college, I always had an interest in trying to understand the dynamics of economies and businesses. Strange that so early, but yeah. And growing up in the Boston area, there's been a real lesson of many things that in the 1970s and early 80s, Massachusetts was sort of considered like a dead economy. And there was a bunch of old shoe factories and warehouses, not much going on. And then this thing came around called the mini computer industry, with coming basically out of MIT with Digital and Prime and Wang and all these companies. And that was sort of when I was just getting out of school. And I joined a research company called the International Data Corporation to study what are these things being used for and why and how much do people like them? What's this all about? And so I got into the business there. And of course, those companies turned Massachusetts around and led to the so-called Massachusetts miracle and actually launched Mike Dukakis's presidential campaign. So we had an extremely positive view of tech in our state. And the company I work for, IDC, we International Data, we studied the global use of computers. And so for very early times, it was like, well, what's going on in Europe and what's going on in Asia and elsewhere? And that became extremely relevant in the late 80s and early 90s when the challenge from Japan emerged. Mm-hmm. And, everybody thought that Fujitsu and Hitachi and Toshiba and NEC and Matsushita and all these companies were destined to take over the world. But as it turned out, that was not the case. And the Silicon Valley companies, Microsoft and Intel and Oracle and Compaq and all these companies basically crushed them and did it. And so we tracked all of that. And it started leading in, and of course, tech was everybody's favorite industry through all that period. But around 2017, perceptions started to change and people started to be much more suspicious and even very negative about tech. And so to me, this was very unfortunate because once again, you can see the challenge this time from China and a bit from India. And tech is probably the linchpin of how we do there. And so the work that I've been doing for all these years is really tracking the evolution of global competition in the tech sector, from mainframes to mini computers to personal computers to mobile phones to the internet, and now the AI industry. And that's sort of where I'm coming from. I'm trying to make sense of who's winning, who's losing, and why in those spaces.
Those are big questions that obviously do matter and how they get addressed. Let's talk a little bit about the arc of technology that might inform why we got to at an inflection point like you were describing. When people were looking at big IBM computer rooms that spat out cards, or Wang computers and word processors that would have fairly simple games on them every once in a while, to the internet revolution and things kind of moving into a merger between everyday communications and actual computing going on. We had technology in our lives, but it wasn't evident to a lot of people that some organized force could be kind of influencing our lives through that. Maybe they could, but we didn't have kind of that sense. But in the evolution of technology, where do you think it was that the concerns, suspicions, as you've kind of titled in the book, the scapegoats start coming in? I mean, there's scapegoats in terms of hollowing out industries, the Godzilla eating Manhattan example of Japan. But I think we're dealing with something very different now than those kinds of things. But correct me if I'm wrong on that assumption.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a very straightforward one, that for most of the industry's history, it was very popular, and still is with the vast majority of consumers. But in the media, in the press, in policymakers, there's all kinds of critiques that it's polarizing the country and spreading misinformation and addicting children and introducing bias and destroying privacy, and 9 million things that it's being accused of. And the book rebuts a lot of those. But the turning point to us was a very simple one. It was indeed the election of Donald Trump in 2016, that all the negative coverage basically started after that, because technology was in many ways blamed for that victory by those who didn't want to see Trump win. And you remember, it was like, oh, well, he uses Twitter so much. And there was Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, and there was Russian misinformation and Russian bots. And all of these things were basically really blown and exaggerated greatly to basically make the case that the technology was in many ways at fault for what had happened. And since then, all of these things, the fears I mentioned, which were always there, have been given a lot more life and energy, and in many ways have become the conventional wisdom. And now you see that with technology like AI, where AI being an incredible technology that people have been working on for the last 80 years. And it finally gets here, and probably 90% of the coverage is about the problems that might come with it, rather than all the benefits and all the actual needs that we have. And so that flip started then. It continues to this day, and it's a real concern of ours and the work that we do.
Well, talk a little bit about whether it matters kind of to separate hardware from software when it comes to these concerns or this challenge. Because my own instinct is there's a little bit of both, but it seems like the software side of it really amplified a lot of the concerns. Social media is overwhelmingly a software kind of animal. So a lot of the anxieties, concerns, accusations are about algorithms, which software, and the addictiveness kind of written into the code. But there's also a tech part of it where people might feel like, oh, a certain kind of chip is a backdoor into my life or tracks where I'm going. If you thought about when the Macintosh came into the market, people had, the first mobile phones, they were bricks. People didn't think that their lives were being tracked in these things. Yeah. But now it's in the palm of your hand, on your wrist, in your car. And so the suspicions follow. But the hardware versus tech versus software part of it does it make no difference? Or do you think that there's more of a concern in one area versus the other these days?
I think that distinction of the hardware versus the software and the data, if you want to call that software, is extremely important from a competitiveness point of view, because America dominates the software and the information, but is losing ground rapidly in most of the dimensions of the physical hardware. And that is a real concern in many, many areas. But, all those sort of fears that you mentioned, to me, they have a grain of truth to all of them. They clearly do. But to our work, that they're just, the balance is wrong. And one simple example, you take privacy, and it's really easy, as you did, to track all the potential problems that you're tracked, your location is known, the data's there forever, there's algorithms running about whatever you do, and Google knows what you searched on. All these things, they're all true. And China shows you what some of the downsides of that might be. But the way that technology increases individual privacy are so pervasive and so obvious that they're almost never mentioned. But if you go back before the internet, how did people learn about anything? They went to a bookstore or a library, or they asked somebody. And in most cases, they had virtually no privacy whatsoever. And information was extremely hard to get, particularly sensitive information about health or gender or sex or any of these things, that the ability to get information more or less anonymously for the vast majority of people has been an incredible increase in privacy. And you go back to like small town America, how much privacy did anybody have living in a small house in a small town for 20 or 30 years, where everybody knew pretty much everything about you? And we believe that sort of analysis of really looking at not just the cons, but the pros will expose many of those charges as myths, in the sense that the belief that they're fundamentally all risk just is ignoring the benefits. And you could do the same sort of thing for misinformation or bias or AI or really any of them. And that's sort of what our book does.
Well, I think it's a really interesting perspective. Since we are the China desk, let's bring the book into the China conversation. Share with the audience a little bit about what you see as kind of the core baskets of the subject matter that really kind of get at China as a challenge or China as the opportunity, but how it fits into the core work of your book.
Yeah, that's great. And we'll do that through a couple of different lenses. And the first one, and this is one that I think is you hear all the time, is that this is a new Cold War, and people draw the parallels to the old Soviet Union. And we think that's a terrible analogy. And the reason we think it's bad is that if you look at China today, there are four huge dimensions to what it's doing. It's the world's largest market for a vast amount of products and services. It's the world's largest supplier of a great many products around the world. It's America's toughest competitor in all kinds of industries. And it's a geopolitical and military rival. Now, if you compare that to the Soviet Union, it was only the latter of those. It was not a major market for U.S. firms. It was not a significant supplier of really anything to America. And in most industries, it was, in fact, virtually every industry, it was not a serious competitor. It was solely a military and geopolitical rival. And so that analogy is just wrong, because you can't just focus on that dimension, because the other three dimensions are so absolutely critical. Many American industries are dependent on China as a supplier. If you want to be a successful firm, you really do need to be in the world's largest market if you want to get the scale to compete. And from a competitive point of view, they are our main rival in many, many, many sectors. So that analogy, I think, takes people down a military and geopolitical path and a sort of tension escalating path that is not necessarily the ideal way that we should go. And in the same way, people also compare the China challenge to that of Japan, and that's not true either, because Japan was never a huge market for U.S. firms. It was an interesting supplier and competitor, but it was an ally. And so, two of those dimensions, Japan was relevant, but two not. And so only China has this sort of four-dimensional challenge to the United States. And to really think through what should be done or how to go about it, you really need to factor in all four of those dimensions, which are often in conflict with one another.
Now, I guess there's a few things that kind of come to mind about the framework, and when it comes to them being the largest market in certain goods and services, it wasn't always so, and it may not always be so. And so I wonder, when you look at it through the lens of technology, whether there are any trends out there that might give pause for the assumption, not saying it was your assumption, but if we just take what has happened from the recent past to today and just don't factor in changes that might be happening in China, is there anything on the horizon that might sort of question that? I mean, we know that there's demographic change. There's actions the government might take there that make it less trustworthy or less palatable. Maybe there's alternatives that are percolating in other places to diversify. But what's your sense on that? Is it basically safely in this trajectory where there's nothing in the medium term that would send a bending of the curve?
In terms of a single country, I think it's pretty much on that trajectory. That you've got only India has a comparable population, and India has so much more development to go to catch up with China. So, the work we do is a 5 and 10 years sort of length at max, and in that period, there's the United States, there's Europe, and there's China, and they're all going to be really large. So China will be the single biggest country market, but if you define a market as the West, well, that'll be a bigger market. So it all depends on how you want to define it. But if you are a McDonald's or you're a Marriott or a Starbucks or the old Kentucky Fried, they really want to be in China because that's huge scale in business for them. So I think that dimension is not going away at all. And it also, to succeed in that market, you've got to be pretty good. And so I don't think so. I think that all these dimensions stay with us for quite a long time.
And specifically on tech, again, China wasn't always the trusted platform or the manufacturing hub. There's a lot of investment that went into making that so. They were able to do things on scale and at a speed that sort of their form of government and society lends itself to in a way. But do you see anything on that front where others may be opening, and whether there's trust or other ways to sort of look at a notion of strategic decoupling where it's not the everyday kind of technology people are concerned about, but the most advanced maybe in other areas? How do you see that playing out?
And these are the critical questions, really. But I always start with the basics that we made China into the success that it is today. When they joined the WTO back in 2001, particularly from a tech sector, all of the companies basically looked at the manufacturing capacity of what was there, and they set up shop to make chips and displays and storage devices and PCs and smartphones and everything else. But if we didn't do it in China, we still probably would have done it somewhere else in Asia. It's not like that stuff would have necessarily come back to America, but we created that. And as you, I'm sure, well know, that we created on the belief that, as they grow, they'll become more like us. And that was always the theory. And it wasn't a bad theory. It was actually quite logical because we saw that Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, all of them became more liberal as they became wealthier and more like us than they were when they were impoverished like China was. And so that belief wasn't crazy, but it just turned out to be wrong.
And we'll talk a little bit about the role of the model of the tigers, and China not really being one of the tigers. It's something somewhat different at this point.
Yeah, I stress that it actually resembles the tigers in a lot of ways, but it is different in some. That sometimes in the West we go down a path saying that, well, China is successful because of its oppression of its citizens and its censorship and its slave labor and its environmental, problems and all of these things. And I would say in many cases, they're actually really successful in spite of all of those things. That, what China really has done to grow is virtually identical to what Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and Singapore did decades earlier when people talked about Asian tigers and the Asian miracle. And what did they do? They had a focus on commodity manufacturing. They had a disciplined, skilled workforce. They had import protection policies. They had engaged state. They had high savings rates. They had all of these basic ingredients, and more than anything else, they had a commitment to move up the value chains in those industries over time. And they all started off making things like keyboards and PC mice and floppy disk drives, and now they make the world's most advanced displays and chips and storage devices and everything else. And it's that sort of starting at the bottom and working your way up the value chain that actually is the exact opposite of how America and the West have done it. American companies like Apple and Microsoft, and they focus on the top of the value chain, the customer experience, the software, the data. And those are actually the most profitable segments. And that's why those companies have been so spectacularly successful financially. But they've essentially seeded all of the commodity manufacturing below that. And to me, that is the Asian tiger model. Start low, work your way up over time, with a lot of support from the government, and they did all that. But China brings one additional piece of that the other ones didn't have, and that is that it's such a big market that it could basically force or strongly encourage American companies to share technology as essentially the price for doing business in China. And Japan, Taiwan, Korea, they were never big enough to really do that. And so it was easier for America to protect its technology than it's been with China. But the basic economic development model was written long ago by Singapore President Lee Kuan Yew. His whole thing was, and all of those places were not democratic in their early years. They were all one-party states with a very strong military, and many of them didn't really become democratic in Korea and Taiwan's case until the late 80s and 90s, but they all did. And so that was, again, the hope of China might too. And I wouldn't rule out that someday maybe it will, but there's no sign of that now. And so that's been the big surprise, the downside, and criticism of American it's been pretty obvious for a long time, and not much has really happened there. And you get into, especially in the Taiwan dimension and others, where we've seen these problems building over time and done precious little about them until very recently with the CHIPS Act and other things.
Yeah, well, I think you make some important distinctions and definitions. It seems to me one of the big differences about China is that it's one country, a big one. When you're dealing with the tigers, it was plural. There's a handful of tigers, and so on aggregate, if they acted as one, maybe there would have been the leverage that you were describing. But once it becomes one big country that's a supplier, it's a different form of leverage. And of course, you've made the distinction in the other forms of analysis that these were essentially allies. And so you didn't have some of those other considerations. With China, we've got everything from over the years looking into nuclear secrets and IP issues that have a different flavor than when it's with an ally, and things like COVID and other kinds of unpleasant experiences that make sort of the reputation and trust issues with China different than we had, even when we were kicking around some trade disputes and IP issues over the years with some of the tigers coming up. I remember many years ago, you used to be able to go to some of these countries and get some pretty incredible discounts on knockoff products.
Absolutely.
But in China, it's scale and it's now, and it's definitely not an ally. And so an interesting challenge. But I guess before putting words in your mouth about what China is, when it comes to tech and the sort of the myths and scapegoating and stuff like that, What do you think are kind of the big ones that most apply to the China challenge, as opposed to just the big tech, big information kind of things that I think inform the broader work of the book?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is the main thing we need to do with China is compete effectively against them. And if the government and policymakers and others start turning against tech in terms of its alleged impact on American society, that's not going to be good for the dynamics of those companies over time. And you look at antitrust stuff and other things that are being knocked about. But, the ability to compete remains the most important thing. You look at that today with NVIDIA and OpenAI just, rushing ahead of anything going on there. And the ability to do that is still very, very strong, with one exception, is that we can't make any of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We can.
In your mind, will it always be thus? Is there something structural that we can't really change? I mean, there obviously that we didn't used to have all of this infrastructure inside of China. It came with a lot of, sure, there were things that were done inside China, but there was a lot of help from the outside in terms of capital, know-how, multilateral lending, all kinds of things that made it so. It's not an on-off switch. It wasn't with China, but could we not do similar things in this hemisphere?
Absolutely, but it took about 20 years to get into the mess we're in,
and billions, if not trillions, of dollars.
Yeah, and it's going to take more than 5 years to get out of it. 10 might be a decent number, but sure, Mexico, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Korea, lots of places you can start to make stuff, but the catch-up process is very difficult because of cost competitiveness with China, and at the very high end, other than Taiwan, nobody seems to be able to really keep up with what they're doing, and so I don't see a quick solution to what we're doing. I think all those things can help, moving to other countries and friendshoring, and particularly relying more on Japan and South Korea, because they do have some very high quality, advanced manufacturing. But America, if you look at the chip stuff now, it still takes so long to set up these plants and get them going. It's a hard slog, and it's not going to be a quick solution. Yeah, how much money we throw at it.
Well, you mentioned sort of the hard slog on the manufacturing side, and also antitrust as an area of concern. What other areas or policies would you recommend that thought leaders and policymakers focus on to get America in the right position to enhance the competitiveness of our tech sector so that we compete our way out of this?
I would start with the most obvious one today, which is AI, that you need a government and a media and a policy community that really believes that this is the path we need to get on to remain competitive, and that we need to automate things, that we're going to have all kinds of problems of caring for the elderly and educating people, and labor shortages and cost challenges, coping with India and China, that we need all kinds of automation and robotics, and that AI is by far the most likely path to go there. But that's not what I hear. We hear people saying, oh, it's going to wipe out jobs. It's going to just make society even more unequal. It's going to diminish human worth. You can't control it. All of those narratives, which, again, there's some scenarios of truth within them, but to us are highly exaggerated, put us on the wrong side of that issue, because you can be sure that China and India and others are not going to put the brakes on what they can do in that space. And so, to me, how often do you even hear anyone talking in Washington talk about the need for America to be the leader in that area in the way they used to? They don't. And I think that's pretty scary, because if you lose that, particularly if you lose it badly, you're going to it's going to affect so many different things, because AI is a general purpose technology that will be, pretty much everywhere.
Yeah. Well, is there a role for trust and safeguards that would help make people more inclined to see the positives when they had a degree of trust that there's a community of experts, there's collaboration across allies in meaningful countries that are setting standards, and that there's transparency and accountability. I mean, we see some of this slugfest going on in the discussion of AI with Elon Musk versus some others. That gets a lot of attention because of who he is, of course, has a platform and an audience. But he raises some important questions that I think a lot of people would want to understand and have addressed. But at least when it comes to the China questions of it, in my mind, that China hasn't proven itself to be very transparent and accountable on some important transnational issues. And so to me, it would be rational to have some anxiety if that is where the stuff is getting programmed and it's baked into hardware and software. But maybe there's ways to, whether it's manufacturing or otherwise, that we have a way to get to trust and safeguards in this area. Am I wrong, or am I indulging in the myths, or is there really a positive way forward on that?
Yeah. When you look at trust and accountability and transparency, they always stress is that when any company brings something to market in the United States, they're responsible for that product being reasonably safe. And existing laws provide a lot of protection against products that are unsafe or somehow harm people. And so you don't always need a whole set of new laws. You may need to tweak them a little bit, but the basic standards of consumer protection, they don't fundamentally change when you get to AI. But when you get to China, I would think less about just software and data, but think about the intelligence that will go into robots and cars and machinery and all of the things that they have strong positions in. Maybe you look at electronic vehicles and the combination of AI and an EV. If they're dominating the EV, it's a pretty easy step to throw AI on top of that. So, it's that applying it to strategic sectors that is probably the biggest challenge you see from them in AI. No one country is going to own AI. The principles are well understood of how it works, the scale of what you need, the processing power, and who has the data to run it is an interesting issue in each country. But it's not that China is going to own AI, but if they apply it to drones, to airplanes, to cars, to military equipment, and they do a better job of that, then those are big. One of the themes of the book is, hey, we can't afford to seed any more strategic industries, and we've seeded quite a few in recent years. And you see now with cars coming right down and staring us in the face that there are enormous advantages in EVs versus the cost of Europe or America trying to make similar products, because the whole supply chain is out there.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly seems like there is room for growth in what we do in our education system, that even when manufacturing of advanced tech comes to the United States, there is a challenge of the appropriately trained and educated workforce to operate the facilities. And then there's always the question of the resources that are used to induce or help make the deal to bring the opportunity to a particular state or location. So you have taxpayer and workforce that sometimes have the workforce brought in for the project. And so there's some natural politics that kind of make friction there. But we've only really in policy talked about subsidizing some areas and maybe raising tariffs in other areas. But it seems like we might not be doing all we could to fuel a culture of revival in America in some of these ways. Do you see an element of that in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And, as I said earlier, it's really hard to do these things because we've a lot of the skills needed have really atrophied in this country. But that's why I think, to me, the most direct path is for companies like Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing and Samsung to build plants here because they know how to do it, and they're allies and friends of ours, and they will do it much. In many cases, they're probably going to have an easier time doing that than an Intel or American company that's been away from that space for a long time. So that's one path. The other path, and this one maybe is a little more controversial, but in the end, what solved a lot of the U.S.-Japan trade tensions was having Japan make cars in the United States. Mm-hmm. And I would never rule out the possibility of getting China to make some plants in the United States and let them make some EVs here and other products that, that brings a whole different set of politics and dynamics and perceptions that can take some of the intensity and hard feelings out of the relationship. So, that with China, that's obviously politically more difficult than it was in Japan, but it wasn't easy in Japan's case either. If you lived through that time, they weren't exactly popular as they took on the auto industry. So the idea of people who are leaders making factories in the U.S. without necessarily think that American companies have to do all of it might be a useful line of thinking.
Well, in our remaining time, there's kind of two big areas that I would like to get your thoughts on. One is just the general concept of reciprocity. Even if we think of in some cases, China obviously is not an ally, so it might be a different kettle of fish to have them play a significant role manufacturing in the United States. But who knows? Maybe it gets to that. But what about our companies having some reciprocal access into China? How do you see that kind of a principle applying to our way forward in tech?
I mean, we have a case right in front of us now where reciprocity is the answer, and that is the whole thing with TikTok. We raise all this stuff about TikTok, about security and data and all, and that's all fine. But the more compelling point is, well, why should we let a Chinese social media company do business in America when X and Google and Facebook can't do anything in China? How is that fair? How does that make any sense? How is that not an easy story to say to the world and say, yeah, we'll let TikTok in as soon as you let us in? Yeah. And the fact that we don't do that, in some ways it makes us look sort of dumb. So why wouldn't we do that? And so reciprocity works there. It works in many other areas where, you look at the advanced tech that we're now withholding from China. Well, yeah, you can see why we're doing that. But it'd be nice as all right, if you give us something on one end, we'll give you some of this, and get into more of a, it may seem Pollyannish, but more of a balanced negotiation rather than these sort of escalating trade war type stuff that's happening today, which is very hard to see having a very positive outcome.
Well, from my point of view, I think that there was a meridian in time that mattered, and that was sort of pre-Xi Jinping and then post-Xi Jinping. And a lot of what you describe, I think, was very much an element of what American and allied strategies were in engaging China and China engaging those parties back. It was imperfect. It was never what people might have imagined in terms of the grand arc of the theory of peaceful evolution into a friend that is just like us, where our differences narrow and cooperation expands. But I think there was something very different about Xi Jinping, and not necessarily the focus of your book or our conversation today, but I think that might be an element of what's different. And that leads to my other sort of last bucket of conversation, and that's Taiwan. And I think that is, while it's always been kind of a part of the talking points from the People's Republic of China, especially from the Nixon-Kissinger opening forward. The Taiwan has always come up, but there's been a bit of a dance that was understood. And there was not necessarily a belief that it would be pushed to a real military crisis or some other crisis in the immediate term, that there was room for maneuver and negotiation, and there might be periods of tension and de-escalation. But today, it feels different. Doesn't mean that an attack is coming tomorrow, but it sure feels different. But from your point of view, when you look at how tech industries are aligned, what have you, how would you sort of look at what that challenge really presents to our way of life? It's not really a matter of whether Taiwan is good or bad. It's just a matter of if China does something bad there, regardless of the motivations, that's going to have a big ripple effect on our way of life.
Yeah, indeed. But my background is not in geopolitics and all, but when I always look at it, it's like, all right, well, our policy is there's one China. And all right, if there's one China, they're going to get reunited. And whose terms are they going to mostly get reunited on? And all you have to do is look at the Hong Kong thing, where they swallowed up Hong Kong, broke all the promises they had, and the world basically didn't bat an eye. And so why do we care so much about Taiwan? Well, the reason is clear, and it has to do with semiconductor manufacturing. And to me, we put ourselves in this. When they make 90% of the world's most advanced chips, you have a fundamentally unstable dynamic that gives us, we've raised the stakes on how important that issue is to us, needlessly, I think. And so, people, you can see, obviously, scenarios of conflict and even war there. And the only reason that is the case is that we're so dependent. And that's why having other sources in that space, to me, just seems critical. And the sooner the better. And I do blame some of our own tech companies for sitting around watching that happen over the last 10 or 20 years and allowing America to become so dependent on a country that is fundamentally vulnerable to, as I say, our own policy is there's one China. It's not that there's two. And so, I don't know. I hope for the best, and I think it's widely said, and I believe it to be true, that President Xi wants to get that unification done before he leaves office. I think that seems a highly likely scenario to cap his legacy. So what's that? 5 years, 6 years, 8 years? Who knows? But they look at it and they say, "Hey, everybody screamed about Hong Kong. Nobody did a thing." And I'm sure that's exactly how they see it. And the rest of the world, it means more to us because we have the tech companies. The Europeans, they're not that fussed about Taiwan. Even the Japanese and the South Koreans aren't in the economic point of view. So it's very scary. It's our greatest vulnerability, what might happen there.
Well, I think that there'd be a lot of people would say, yeah, it might have been a question of why we became so dependent on advanced semiconductors from Taiwan. But then they'd say it's also kind of questionable how we became so dependent on a country like China that is willing to do these things against Taiwan and us. It's quite the pickle we put ourselves in on both sides there.
Short-term profits.
Yeah.
People made a lot of money moving stuff to China, and now most of them are retired, and 20 years later, you have these problems where they own the value chains of so many industries, particularly the things like the rare earths and batteries and those fundamental things that they've spent the last 10 or 15 years, 20 years building a dominant position in those spaces. And we were, plenty of people saw it, but actually doing something about it has proven difficult.
Well, I appreciate you taking your time with us today. I mean, I think my favorite parts of the arc of your book are just the optimism that we can and should find a way to compete our way through this. A lot of what we have tried to talk about on the podcast is that while it's the China desk, getting things right in America can go a long way to making that a less risky and more plausible good outcome for us. And I think that the challenge to kind of look hard at what we're doing here and with other friends really is an opportunity worthy of being seized. And so I think there's some rich material to pull from here. And I appreciate you taking the time to talk through how the China piece fits through a broader book on the subject. We always love the outside perspective coming into the China conversation. But David, for those in the audience that want to follow your work, where would you point them?
Go to Amazon and buy a copy of the book, Technology, Fears and Scapegoats, or any of the major places you can buy it. And that'll give you a lot of our thinking on this. And for those of you who don't know, the organization, the Information Technology Innovation Foundation, looks at all of these issues in in-depth research, and just about all the content there is public domain, and a great deal of opinions and recommendations in all of these spaces will be found there. And that's itif.org, or you can get my Twitter stuff at Moschella at X.
Very good. Well, for our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing, and give a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining, and thank you especially to David Moschella for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.